In 1975, Columbia announced the imminent release of The Complete Robert Johnson, The Man and His Music, a promised 3 LP set. As a trusting person, I mentioned it in the first edition of this book. One reader braved a Minnesota blizzard to find it, hitting every record store in the Twin Cities. The occasion for the set was the discovery of the facts of Johnson's life, along with the grail of the blues, photographs of the man himself. 11 years would pass before even one saw the light of day. And Robert Johnson, The Complete Recordings, Columbia, did not appear until 1990. What happened? Working independently, 2 researchers, Steve LeVere, Harmonica Frank's rediscoverer, and Mac McCormick, a blues researcher associated with the Smithsonian, had after years of work made contact with Johnson's surviving sister in Baltimore. By means of keepsakes unpacked and clues left behind, this led to a reconstruction of Johnson's life, including the details of his murder. But for those who had spent years living with Johnson's music, the picture spoke more clearly than any facts. The first to surface appeared in a special issue of Rolling Stone, February 13, 1986. Celebrating the induction of the first members of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, Johnson was honored as an early influence. Originally made in a coin-operated photo booth in the early 30s, the shot shows Johnson in a white shirt and suspenders with a cigarette in his mouth and a guitar in his hands. The face is smooth and serious, and you can read any of Johnson's songs into his flat, silent gaze. But it is the fingers that are riveting, long, almost prehensile fingers that snake over the neck of the guitar like hoodoo bone charms. 3 years went by before a second photograph appeared. In 78 Quarterly, Volume 1, Number 4, 1989, the issue included a debunking essay by Stephen Kalt and Gail Dean Wardlow, interviews with various Knew Him Wins insisting that Johnson was nothing special either as a guitarist or a singer. You should have heard My Cousin Ira, and a useful guide to local archaic or misleading terms in Johnson's lyrics by Kalt. The photo, like the first, provided by LeVere, who went on to market both as posters and t-shirts, made at the Hooks Brothers studio in Memphis, showed a grinning, handsome man superbly dressed in fedora, double-breasted pinstripe suit, and shiny black shoes. Only the fingers on the guitar Johnson held, like a trophy, matched the power of the first shot. In 2005, the guitarist Stephen Shine found a photo identified as Old Snapshot Blues Guitar B.B. King on eBay and ordered it. When it arrived, showing a dark-skinned man with a white Stetson and long fingers and a lighter-skinned man in a black hat, Shine identified it as a portrait of Johnson and Johnny Shines. Publication in Vanity Fair set off years of dispute. The Houston forensic analyst Lois Johnson, working with the Robert Johnson estate, authenticated the photo in 2013. Johnson's right eye is bright, his left eye half closed. In a dark suit and striped tie, he has a young man's grin. Both the photo booth and the studio photos were included along with photos of Johnson's mother, stepfather, sister, wife, and contemporaneous blues players as illustrations for Steve LeVere's extensive notes to The Complete Recordings, the double CD box set that finally kept or broke the 15-year-old promise of The Complete Robert Johnson, produced by LeVere and Frank Driggs, who had produced King of the Delta Blues Singers 29 years earlier. To my mind, the package was a botch from beginning to end. Both photos of Johnson were badly cropped. The 41 then extant Johnson recordings, minus a later discovered take of Traveling Riverside Blues, included on the 1998 reissue of King of the Delta Blues Singers, were programmed with alternate takes following master takes, which meant that listening to the set was like reading a discography. LeVere's extensive historical and interpretive essays were an embarrassment, at times verging on surely unintentional racism, and his comments on his own sometimes incomplete transcriptions of Johnson's lyrics were occasionally stupefying. LeVere described Johnson's I Can Study Rain and I've Been Studying the Rain in Preaching Blues as phonetically correct, although meaningless. Presumably he meant syntactically or grammatically correct, but it's the second claim that's meaningless. Studying rain is symbolism, carried forward from many older blues songs to Bob Dylan songs echoing back to Shakespeare. It means to contemplate dread. In 2011, along with the Centennial Collection, Columbia issued a grossly irrelevant, extraordinarily expensive box set, comprised of the double CD of Johnson's recordings, 45 RPM 10-inch replicas of the Johnson 78s released in 1936 and 1937, a collection of 1928 to 32 blues recordings issued by Victor, which as RCA Victor was now part of Sony Columbia, recordings made by other performers at the sessions for which Johnson was present, quote, folk and hillbilly, cowboy and Mexican, end of quote, and a DVD of the Peter Meyer documentary discussed below. Not included in the box, but available separately. The one great result of this white elephant, which may actually have sold in the dozens, was Robert Johnson's Hellhound on My Ale, A-L-E. Columbia Legend Dogfish Head Craft Brewery. The 25-ounce bottle looked to be all concept, no beer. With lemons, the label read, as a shout-out to Robert Johnson's mentor, Blind Lemon Jefferson. It was rich with a huge head. Flavor swam through the glass. It was so smooth it was like drinking a sunset. When I reached again for the bottle, it was empty. The most effective critical attack on LeVere's work, which was followed by his licensing of countless redundant Johnson collections, often with Johnson's recordings program alongside second-rate cover versions, was Gene Santoro's Robert Johnson in the Nation, October 8, 1980, collected in his Dancing in Your Head, New York, Oxford, 1994. The most comprehensive and alarming examination of LeVere's business practices was Robert Gordon's The Devil's Work, The Plundering of Robert Johnson, in LA Weekly, July 5th to 11th, 1991. By far the most gratifying spawn of the set was Tony Sherman's The Hellhound's Trail, following Robert Johnson. In Musician, January 1991, Sherman drew out Eric Clapton, Keith Richards, Billy Gibbons, Vernon Reid, Robert Plant, Ry Cooder, Robbie Robertson, and more on Johnson. As shameless fans or resentful competitors, they talked about genes, madness, Faust, and rhythm, in almost every case adding something new to music most of them had been listening to, at least since Bob Dylan included King of the Delta Blues Singers as one of the talismans scattered across the cover of his 1965 Bringing It All Back Home. Dollars, in a way, confirmed the story. The complete recordings made the Billboard charts. It went gold. It won a Grammy. Johnson was no longer an invisible pop star. He was simply not present. The Columbia Publicity Department got used to journalists and disc jockeys calling to inquire whether Mr. Johnson might be available for interviews. That he was not allowed the U.S. Postal Service, which does not recognize the living, to bring out a lovely Robert Johnson stamp in 1994, the photo booth image, absent the cigarette. But that was later. In the early 70s, both McCormick and LeVere came up with much of the same material. Releases were obtained from Johnson's apparent heirs, but they canceled each other out. A struggle over copywriting, possession of documents, invasion of privacy, and licensing provoked a legal battle that, despite LeVere's successful marginalization of McCormick, was not settled until July 15, 2000, when the Mississippi Supreme Court affirmed a 1998 decision by the Lafleur County Chancery Judge John Barwell that Claude Johnson of Crystal Springs, Mississippi, was Johnson's son and sole legal heir. His mother, Virgie Jane Smith, had intercourse with Johnson in 1931. Claude Johnson was born 9 months later. In 1937, Claude Johnson remembered his father came to visit his grandparents, with whom he was living, would not allow the boy to meet him. They told my daddy they didn't want no part of him. Johnson told Rick Bragg of the New York Times. Mississippian is son of the father of blues, June 17th, 2000. They told my daddy they didn't want no part of him, Johnson told Rick Bragg of the New York Times. They said he was working for the devil, and they wouldn't even let me go out and touch him. I stood in the door, and he stood on the ground, and that is as close as I ever got to him. The court's decision was based on the videotaped deposition of Eula Mae Williams, a friend of Virgie Jane Smith's, who described witnessing Smith having sex with Johnson, as she herself was nearby in, quote, the lush, piney woods of Copiah County, end of quote. I had to look that up, too. As Claude Johnson's attorney Jim Kitchens put it, making love with her own boyfriend. With the site of Johnson's burial a matter of fierce contention, DNA evidence was unavailable. As far as we know, Judge Mike Mills wrote for the court. That's an interesting pop culture name. Judge Mike Mills wrote for the court. Johnson is buried down by the highway, so his old evil spirit can get a Greyhound bus and ride. Claude Johnson did not have to take the bus to Los Angeles when in 2006 he was present at the Grammy Awards to accept the Lifetime Achievement Award on behalf of his father. His first royalty payments made in 1999 amounted to close to $2 million. Make some noise for RJ. LL Cool J said at the Grammys. as the camera panned to pick up Claude Johnson. I found it incredibly powerful to learn and see that Robert Johnson's son is alive and well, wrote David Marchese, at the time a journalism student at NYU. It makes RJ seem real in a way that had never occurred to me before, as if John Henry or Paul Bunyan's kid showed up somewhere. McCormick's once promised book on Johnson, Biography of a Phantom, has never appeared. And over time, McCormick has come to doubt many of his own discoveries, not to mention those of others, but works partly based on his research are worth seeking out. The late Robert Palmer's Deep Blues, New York Viking, 1981. See also Robert Mugg's documentary version of the same name, Windstar Video. Included a good summary. Peter Guralnick's short book, Searching for Robert Johnson, 1989, combines biography with a close musical analysis. There are other ways of listening. When You Walk in the Room is an argument for the uniqueness of Johnson's work. Instrumental Break draws on my notes to the admittedly completely redundant Martin Scorsese Presents the Blues Robert Johnson, Columbia Legacy, 2003, with a story of the life of Robert Johnson might have lived if he hadn't died when he did. By the end, in 2012, he's trying to squeeze royalties out of the White House. Charles Shaar Murray's discussion of Johnson and Crosstown Traffic, a study of Jimi Hendrix, erases the mystification that often accompanies comment on the blues and brings Johnson to life as an ordinary historical actor. Not that such a conception will ever rule because of a story so appealing to the imagination it has become a floating, even automatic signifier, its own frame of reference. Quote, "There's the Bob Dylan lyric about staging the apocalypse for our entertainment, which is what I do," end of quote. The screenwriter and director Paul Haggis, best known for the 2000 film Crash, said in 2014, promoting a new project, not to say himself, quote, "The real Highway 61 actually divided the country, and my movies are kind of divisive. But the real reason was because it was at the crossroads of Highway 61 where the bluesman Robert Johnson sold his soul to the devil for his talent. And I think in some ways I've sold my soul for my talent." Enough or not. Researching his Delta Blues, New York, Norton, 2008, Ted Gioia asked McCormick if the time had come to put the story of Johnson selling his soul to rest. Gioia wrote in 2012, the journal Radio Silence. "When I went to New Orleans in the late 1940s to visit some record collectors," McCormick said to Gioia, "they told me the same story. You need to remember that almost nothing had been published on Robert Johnson at that time, yet these record collectors had heard about Robert Johnson selling his soul to the devil. I subsequently heard the same story within the black community. The fact that the same story circulated among these two groups that had very little to do with each other, impressed me. It suggested that the story had deep roots, probably going back to Johnson himself." I'm going to reread that. "When I went to New Orleans in the late 1940s to visit some record collectors," McCormick said to Gioia, "they told me the same story. You need to remember that almost nothing had been published on Robert Johnson at that time. Yet these record collectors had heard about Robert Johnson selling his soul to the devil. I subsequently heard the same story within the black community. The fact that the same story circulated among these two groups that had very little to do with each other, impressed me. It suggested that the story had deep roots, probably going back to Johnson himself. Still, the artist Kevin Bradley may have had, if not the last word, the best. In his Robert Johnson, one of a series of letterpress posters he placed on the walls of the meandering corridors of the Chelsea Market in New York in 2009, Johnson appeared with blacklit eyes and filed teeth surrounded by a testament. Quote, "They say he sold his soul, but he tricked Satan by putting his soul in his music," end of quote. Maybe the late Tony Wilson had the best last word on the matter in his punk record man autobiography, 24 Hour Party People. Recalling the first Sex Pistols show in Manchester, England on June 4th, 1976, with, by his count, 42 people present. God, what is this? Bloody hell, it's Stepping Stone. And in the next 60 seconds, hearing the Pistols violently murder and then resurrect this simple pop classic. All was made clear as all was destroyed. Only in hearing the old was the new revealed. I will destroy the temple, and in 3 minutes I will rebuild it, saith the Lord, saith Johnny Rotten. In its complete indifference to the niceties of technique and respect, they restored the popular song to the spirit that is the only fucking reason it exists in the first place. Robert Johnson sold his soul at the crossroads. He sold it for this. Good deal. The dream of the great Robert Johnson film remains unrealized, though not for lack of trying, and despite the suggestiveness of Andre Braugher, who throughout most of the 90s played Detective Frank Pimpleton on the great Baltimore cop show Homicide as if he were Robert Johnson's nephew, in terms of both Braugher's dead ringer looks and the hellhound at Pimpleton's back. Alan Greenberg's blazingly readable semi-fictional screenplay Love in Vain, first published in 1983, has bounced back and forth between different producers, directors, and actors. Prince is Robert Johnson? No? Why not Sean Combs? Ever since. Shot instead by Walter Hill in 1986 was John Fusco's moronic script for Crossroads, in which smarmy white Juilliard guitarist Ralph Macchio decides that the discovery of an unrecorded Johnson song will make him rich and famous, and in a cutting contest with a white blues guitarist standing in for Old Scratch, triumphs by playing Mozart. Shot instead by Walter Hill in 1986 was John Fusco's moronic script for Crossroads, in which smarmy white Juilliard guitarist Ralph Macchio decides that the discovery of an unrecorded Johnson song will make him rich and famous, and in a cutting contest with a white blues guitarist standing in for Old Scratch, triumphs by playing Mozart. The first legitimate project to make it to the screen or video was Chris Hunt's 1992 The Search for Robert Johnson, starring John Hammond Jr., the son of Columbia's John Hammond. As compare, it was notable mainly for dazzling footage of Willie Mae Powell, the Willie Mae of Love in Vain, Beautiful in the 30s and Beautiful half a century later, Peter Meyer's 1997 Can't You Hear the Wind Howl, the life and music of Robert Johnson, Windstar video included in Columbia's 2011 box set was better, with narration by Danny Glover, interviews with contemporaneous bluesmen and friends, and reenactments featuring the blues singer Keb Mo as Johnson with as much charisma on screen as he displays on record, which is to say none. Mo is effective in ensemble situations when the camera keeps its distance. The picture begins in magic. A credit sequence is built around Come On In My Kitchen. As Johnson enters a photo booth, each note stands out, tells its own story, then seems to abstract itself from the song, flying off like a bird, then circling back over the singer as if trying to decide whether to light. The film moves on with a young Johnson making a diddly bow, a new husband dancing in tall grass with his new wife. Johnson and Johnny Shines busking on Highway 61 outside of Memphis after their hotel is burned down. Shines talks about playing in all-white town in Illinois where he and Johnson were exhibited as niggers. He say he done that, went to the crossroads, the blues singer Honey Boy Edwards says. No, he never told me that line, Shines replies. If he would have, I'd have called him a liar right to his face, because I know it's a lie. You have no control over your soul. You don't know what you're going to do 10 minutes from now. You think you do. How are you going to do anything with your soul? You are a soul. That word devil, says the bluesman Henry Townsend, taking a more business-like view of the matter. You'd be surprised how effective it is. Wow, that's good. Damn, that's good. Fucking A. That was good. Man. Can't give that passage enough stars, that's for sure. I will reread it. You say he done that, went to the crossroads, the blues singer Honey Boy Edwards says. No, he never told me that line, Shines replies. If he would have, I'd have called him a liar right to his face, because I know it's a lie. You have no control over your soul. You don't know what you're going to do 10 minutes from now. You think you do. How are you going to do anything with your soul? How are you going to do anything with your soul? You are a soul. I love that. It's like the concept of trying to use a tool that's broken to repair the same tool, you know? How are you going to do something with your soul? You are a soul. That's fucking amazing. That word devil, says the bluesman Henry Townsend, taking a more businesslike view of the matter. You'd be surprised how effective it is. Aside from documentaries, the most interesting cinematic references to Johnson appear in Ian Softly's 2005 The Skeleton Key, a twisted, not to say tied in knots, tale of hoodoo in Louisiana just before Hurricane Katrina destroyed New Orleans, which ends with Elvis's If I Can Dream sounding behind the credits and begins with a dying man listening to Come On in My Kitchen on a phonograph, the recording, quote, not treated as an honored, read moribund, part of our heritage, but as something strange and singular, both enticing and forbidden, end of quote. Charles Taylor wrote at the time, see, They Were Expendable, New Jersey Star-Ledger, September 25th, 2005. And in Phoenix, a Cops as Robbers bloodbath made in 1997 for HBO by Danny Cannon. In the Arizona bar she runs, Angelica Houston leans over a jukebox playing Johnson's Terraplane Blues, a cigarette dangling from her lower lip as if it's glued there. Cop Ray Liotta walks in, catches the tune. My grandfather used to have one of those, he says. Good car. It's not about a car, Houston says mordantly. They banter back and forth, tossing lines from the tune at each other like Humphrey Bogart and Lauren Bacall running their horse racing double entendres in The Big Sleep. As if familiarity with Robert Johnson songs on the part of even vaguely cool middle-aged white people can be taken for granted. Later, Liotta, holding his guts inside his body with one hand, desperately flags down a truck. The trucker has Johnson's From 4 Until Late on her radio. Liotta smiles, but for him it's already too late. Robert Johnson, there's fear there, yeah. Keith Richards said years later, a fear of what? If you face fear yourself, you want to tell other people it's faceable. There's no point in ignoring it. That's an element of the expression in what we've done in, say, Gimme Shelter. Fear is just a viable element, an emotion to use in a song as any other emotion. From Mikhail Gilmore, Love and War Inside the Rolling Stones. It's in literary fiction and poetry more than in film or critical analysis that Johnson seems to have found a true second home. Those sophomoric fictional riffs on Johnson have been common coin for decades. T. Karagas Boyle's Breathless Stones in My Pathway, Hellhound on My Trail is an early example. The first work of lasting value was probably Stanley Booth's Standing at the Crossroads, a 9-page playlet meant to let some of the air out of Alan Greenberg's Love in Vain screenplay, where Johnson first meets the devil in a movie theater. Collected in Booth's landmark Rhythm Oil, a journey through the music of the American South, which, like the 1992 Pantheon edition, omits a portfolio of William Eggleston photos from the original edition. Here, with all of the supernatural and none of the magic stripped from the tale, Robert Johnson sells his soul to the devil, or rather he trades his shoes to an old tramp in exchange for a guitar lesson. You be the judge. It's a story to make you nervous, just as Louis Shiner's Steam Engine Time, collected in Joe R. Lansdale's Western anthology, The New Frontier, is a heartbreaker, the small, blocked adventure of a kid showing up in the world with something he calls blues music. But too early, even before the storied evening in 1903 in a depot in Tutwiler, Mississippi, where W.C. Handy encountered a guitarist singing a song about where the Southern crossed the dog. The weirdest music I ever heard, Handy wrote. Was that supposed to be some kind of minstrel song? A woman asks the young guitarist in Shiner's story. No, he says. It wasn't no minstrel song. Ain't heard nothing like it before, she says. Not supposed to have, he says. Things everybody heard before is for shit. The Little Old Cabin in the Lane. Songs like that make people the way they are. In 1995, two novels with Johnson as a shadow character appeared. Sherman Alexie's Reservation Blues, New York, Atlantic Monthly Press, about a Spokane Indian band possessed of Johnson's guitar. Still alive in 1992, he's taken up residence on their reservation. And Walter Mosley's R.L.'s Dream. Reservation Blues regressed too quickly into a rock band novel, but R.L.'s Dream, set in the present in New York City, bringing together a wounded young white woman and a dying blues man, blazed its own trail. It was a huge step for Mosley, justly celebrated for his continuing series of Easy Rawlins detective novels, tense, masked accounts of a black man picking his way through post-war Los Angeles, held up to a doo-wop mirror in a secret country, held up to a doo-wop mirror in my, quote, in a secret country, end of quote. And with his exacting little Scarlet played against what was on the radio in the summer of 1965 and My Like a Rolling Stone. God, there's a lot of name dropping in this fucking book. R.L.'s Dream revealed the limits of the Rawlins books, freed from the constraints of genre. Just as the constraints of genre had originally freed him as a writer, Mosley began to imagine his characters past their own limits. The blues man, thinking back to the short times he'd shared with Johnson in the 1930s, times that left him at once rich and poor, wealthy with a glimpse of possibility, impoverished with the knowledge of all that would forever lie beyond his grasp, now remembers decades between the notes, and so passionately a reader can fill in all that isn't said. Christopher Marlowe and other white geniuses changed in my eyes once I saw them in the contrast to Johnson, Mosley wrote in his literary memoir, Me and Satan. They were no longer figures against whom I compared black genius. Marlowe, in his way, introduced me to Robert Johnson. I was allowed to see this black master of blues in the light of history. In turn, Johnson introduced me to myself. In the Alabama-born poet Diane Blakely's as yet uncollected duets with Robert Johnson, appearing in Bomb and other literary journals since 2002, she weaves a very few lines from Johnson's songs into her own reveries, and the result is that Johnson joins a broader territory than the ethnographic patch of ground to which in the same years blues writers have more and more insistently consigned him. He becomes a citizen of the whole country, traveling through its entire history as if his art can make any past present. In Blakely's Crossroad Blues, the only person named is Ashley Wilkes. In her Little Boy Blue, a Johnson mentor sings, but history shakes with louder sounds. And the sound of country blues is suddenly the overwhelming sound of the Battle of Vicksburg. And the little blue boys are dead Union soldiers. In her Rambling on My Mind, Blakely truly does let her mind wander. One of her own ancestors appears as a haunt, her wounds still open. The first woman killed by Nat Turner's gang, she fades into a slave owner and then into a modern world that Blakely nails shut with her last line. It's a world that, as she hears it, Johnson claimed for songs which foretold more bad news, factory stockyard closings, king shot in Memphis, school kids selling crack, by fallen tractor sheds, all great migrations done. In Dead Shrimp Blues, from the July 15, 2011 number of the Chronicle of Higher Education, she has Tennessee Williams and Maggie from Cat on a Hot Tin Roof cross paths with Johnson in Clarksdale so she can address him directly. Circling around the imagery circling around the imagery in at least one of two Johnson songs built around a metaphor for impotence. She writes like a window peeper in reverse, all undressed down to my humid white girl slip, in lines you can imagine Johnson writing, Kevin Young in flash flood blues from his collection Dear Darkness. Is it once more down to earth, final, and Greyhound bus funnier? Even my wages of sin been garnished. Even my wages of sin been garnished. In 2007, in the Yiddish Policemen's Union, Michael Chabon put a detective on a stakeout. Landsman waits out the funeral in his car, studying it through the good Zeiss lenses and running down the car battery with a CBC radio documentary about the blues singer Robert Johnson, whose singing voice sounds as broken and reedy as a Jew saying Kaddish in the rain. Landsman weighs the sholem in his hand now, a cute little Beretta 22 with a plastic grip. Poisons himself on nicotine and tries to understand the lamentations of this black Delta Yid